In the late summer of 1978, the American highway system still held a lingering sense of romantic freedom, though the shadows were beginning to lengthen. Hitchhiking was a common practice, a staple of a counterculture that had not yet fully surrendered to the cynicism of the coming decade. Young people, drifters, and runaways routinely stood on the shoulders of interstates with their thumbs extended, trusting the unspoken social contract of the road. It was a time before the absolute fear of serial killers had saturated the public consciousness, before 24-hour news cycles warned parents of the specific horrors waiting in passing vehicles. For a teenager trying to cross the country, relying on the kindness of strangers was not considered an act of profound recklessness, but simply a practical method of transit. 15-year-old Mary had grown up in Las Vegas, a city defined by transience and neon, in a home fractured by tension and instability. Seeking an escape from her turbulent domestic life, she packed a few belongings and left. Her destination was California, where she hoped to live with her grandfather and find some semblance of peace. The journey from the desert of Nevada to the coast of California was long, but she navigated it through a series of rides, relying on a quiet resilience that belied her young age. By late September, she had made it to the San Francisco Bay Area, but her plans had unraveled. Unable to locate her grandfather, she found herself wandering the streets of Berkeley, thousands of miles from the familiarity of her past, with dwindling options and nowhere to sleep. Deciding to head back towards Southern California, Mary made her way to an on-ramp of Interstate 80. It was late in the day, the fading light casting long shadows over the concrete. Cars rushed past, anonymous steel boxes moving with absolute purpose, until a blue Ford Econoline van began to slow down. The vehicle pulled over onto the shoulder, kicking up dust and gravel. The door opened, and the man behind the wheel leaned over. He was 51 years old, balding, with a soft, unassuming face and a gentle demeanor. He introduced himself as a merchant marine and spoke with the calm, steady cadence of a grandfather. There was nothing in his appearance to trigger the innate alarm systems that warn us of danger. He did not look like a monster. He looked like someone's neighbor, someone who might spend his weekends tending a lawn or repairing a fence. He offered her a ride south, and Mary, exhausted and desperate for a safe place to rest, climbed into the passenger seat. The initial hours of the drive did little to dispel the illusion of safety. The man spoke pleasantly, offering her a piece of fruit and making casual conversation about the route. The van hummed along the interstate, surrounded by the ordinary flow of nighttime traffic. But as the hours stretched on, the subtle geography of the journey began to shift. The man bypassed the major interchanges that would have kept them on the direct route south. When Mary pointed this out, his tone remained calm, almost paternal. He claimed he was tired, that his vision was blurring from the long drive, and that he needed to pull off the main highway to find a quiet place to rest for a few hours. To a 15-year-old girl in an unfamiliar state, alone in the dark with an adult, challenging this decision felt impossible. The van exited the highway and began navigating the desolate, winding roads of the California interior. The ambient light of civilization faded, replaced by the deep, suffocating darkness of rural isolation. He eventually pulled the van off the paved road entirely, parking in a secluded, pitch-black area. It was here that the gentle grandfather figure evaporated entirely. The transition was abrupt and terrifying. Without warning, he turned on her, his demeanor shifting from mild-mannered to cold, calculated aggression. He forced her into the back of the van, a space that was suddenly transformed from a mode of transport into a lightless prison. For the rest of the night, the interior of the blue van became a sight of absolute horror. She was bound, terrified, and subjected to a brutal, prolonged assault. The man who had offered her an apple just hours before now moved with the detached, methodical cruelty of a predator who had done this before, or had spent a lifetime fantasizing about doing it. Mary was trapped in a moving nightmare, completely at the mercy of a stranger whose capacity for violence seemed limitless. She pleaded with him, offering promises that she would never tell anyone, that she just wanted to go home. But her words fell into an abyss. He did not see her as a person. He saw her as an object, and eventually as a problem that needed to be permanently erased. As dawn approached, the man moved back to the driver's seat and started the engine. The van began to climb into the rugged, unforgiving terrain of Del Puerto Canyon, a remote, sun-baked gorge in Stanislaus County. characterized by steep ravines, scrub brush, and an eerie, absolute silence. He drove deep into the canyon, miles away from any main road or sign of human habitation. When he finally stopped the vehicle, the morning light was beginning to bleed over the hills. He dragged Mary out of the van. She was weak, disoriented, and entirely defenseless, barefoot on the harsh gravel. He forced her toward the edge of a steep, plunging embankment. She begged for her life, promising silence, but he commanded her to take off the few clothes she had left. Then, he reached back into the van and retrieved a heavy wooden hatchet. What happened next on the side of that desolate canyon road defies the boundaries of human comprehension. With terrifying force, he brought the hatchet down, severing her right forearm. As she screamed and tried to protect herself, he struck again, severing her left forearm. The violence was so absolute, so mechanically brutal, that it bypassed mere cruelty and entered the realm of pure annihilation. Believing she was dead, or moments away from death, the man kicked her body over the edge of the embankment. She tumbled down the steep, jagged slope, falling 30 feet before coming to a rest in the mud and debris at the bottom. Near where she landed was a large concrete drainage culvert, a dark, damp pipe designed to channel flash floods beneath the road. He threw her severed limbs down the hill after her, returned to his van, started the engine, and drove away. The sound of his tires crunching on the gravel slowly faded, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind in the scrub oak and the terrifying, absolute isolation of the canyon. Down in the ravine, a profound silence settled over the dirt. By all medical and logical metrics, a human being cannot survive a bilateral traumatic amputation in a remote wilderness without immediate specialized medical intervention. The body enters severe hypovolemic shock. The heart pumps frantically to maintain blood pressure, only to accelerate the loss of fluid. Within minutes, the brain is deprived of oxygen, consciousness fades, and death follows quietly. This is the biological certainty the attacker relied upon when he drove away. But down in the mud of the culvert, Mary's eyes remained open. Her body was shutting down, but an inexplicable primal force overrode her dying physiology. She realized that if she fell asleep in the damp earth, she would never wake up. She looked at the catastrophic injuries where her hands used to be. Blood was pooling rapidly in the dirt. Operating on sheer, unadulterated survival instinct, she forced her bleeding stumps into the thick, dense mud of the ravine. The wet earth packed into the open wounds, acting as a crude, desperate coagulant. The mud slowed the arterial bleeding just enough to keep her heart beating. She lay there in the dirt, the California sun beginning to heat the canyon walls above her. She knew she could not stay hidden. She had to climb. Pushing herself up without the use of her hands, she began to scale the steep 30-foot embankment. Every movement required an agonizing recalculation of balance and pain. She used her elbows, her knees, her bare feet, digging into the loose gravel and dry roots, slipping back, tearing her skin, and pushing upward again. She was entirely naked, covered in mud and her own blood, fighting against gravity and the fading light of her own consciousness. When she finally breached the edge of the road, the landscape offered no salvation. The canyon road was a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through miles of empty, sun-scorched hills. There were no houses, no telephone poles, no signs of life. She stood up. To prevent the remaining blood in her body from draining out, she raised both of her maimed arms high above her head, and then she began to walk. She walked, step by step, mile after mile, under the baking sun, a solitary figure moving through an indifferent landscape, sustained by a willpower that remains a subject of awe among medical professionals and law enforcement to this day. Nearly 3 miles down the canyon road, a couple was driving out for a morning trip. As they rounded a bend, they saw a figure in the distance. At first, the driver thought it was a trick of the light, or perhaps a strange piece of debris. As they drew closer, the reality of the image snapped into focus. A young girl, entirely unclothed, covered in a horrific mixture of dried mud and deep crimson, was walking toward them with her arms raised to the sky. The couple slammed on the brakes. They threw a blanket over her, terrified to touch her for fear of worsening her injuries, and carefully helped her into the back seat of their car. They drove at terrifying speeds out of the canyon, racing toward the nearest hospital in Modesto. In the emergency room, the medical staff was confronted with a trauma so severe it stunned seasoned surgeons. They worked frantically to stabilize her, marveling at the fact that she had any blood pressure at all. But even more astonishing than her physical survival was her absolute mental clarity. Despite being on the precipice of death, despite the unimaginable trauma of the previous 12 hours, Mary refused to let the darkness take her. As detectives arrived at the hospital, expecting to find an unconscious or incoherent victim, they instead found a witness ready to work. She could not speak clearly through the oxygen mask and the pain, but she demanded to communicate. Unable to use her hands, she insisted that a detective hold a sketch pad in front of her. She took a pen in her teeth. With agonizing, deliberate movements of her head, she began to draw. She sketched the face of the man who had destroyed her life. She remembered his receding hairline, the shape of his jaw, the gentle curve of his nose that had initially made him look so harmless. She remembered the specific details of the blue Ford van. She provided the police with a roadmap to a monster. The subsequent manhunt was swift and intense. Armed with the composite sketch and the specific details of the vehicle, law enforcement across California began looking for a balding, middle-aged man in a blue van. It did not take long. A police officer spotted a vehicle matching the exact description parked in a driveway. The man living there was Lawrence Singleton, a 51-year-old merchant marine. When investigators brought the photograph of Singleton to the hospital, Mary identified him instantly. The trial of Lawrence Singleton became a focal point of national horror. The courtroom was a theater of the absurd, where a man who looked like a quiet retiree sat accused of an act of medieval savagery. Singleton's defense was a masterclass in deflection. He claimed he had picked her up, yes, but that he had simply dropped her off unharmed, suggesting she had been attacked by someone else later that night. The jury was subjected to the grim reality of the evidence. But the most devastating moment of the trial came when Mary herself took the stand. Walking into the courtroom, the 15-year-old girl faced the man who had left her to die in a concrete pipe. She raised her right arm to take the oath. At the end of her arm was a metal prosthetic hook. Her testimony was clear, unwavering, and utterly damning. The jury convicted Lawrence Singleton of attempted murder, kidnapping, and mayhem. The public, horrified by the details of the crime, expected the man to be locked away in a lightless cell for the remainder of his natural life. But the late 1970s legal system of California operated under strict sentencing guidelines that mathematically calculated the value of human suffering for the combined crimes of kidnapping a child, torturing her, severing her limbs with an axe, and leaving her to dead in a ravine. The judge handed down the maximum sentence allowed by the law at the time. It was 14 years. The sentence sent a shockwave of disgust through the community, but the true horror of the justice system was yet to be realized. Because of standard good behavior provisions in the California Penal Code, Lawrence Singleton did not serve 14 years. He served 8. In the spring of 1987, the man who had hacked off a teenager's arms and left her in a culvert walked out of a California prison, a free man. His release triggered an unprecedented public outcry. Entire towns rallied to prevent him from moving into their neighborhoods. Mayors declared him unwelcome. Citizens protested with signs, and the state was forced to move him from county to county, living out of a trailer on the grounds of San Quentin simply because no community would allow him to exist near their families. He eventually moved to Florida, slipping quietly into the humid obscurity of the Tampa Bay area, where the local authorities were unaware of the specific terrifying nature of his past. Mary, meanwhile, had to navigate a world completely unsuited for her reality. She had to relearn how to eat, how to dress, how to exist in a society that stared at her prosthetics. She battled severe trauma, nightmares, and the profound psychological weight of knowing that the man who had done this to her was breathing free air. Yet she built a life. She became an artist, learning to paint and sculpt using her prosthetic hooks, channeling her survival into creation. She became an advocate, speaking out for victims' rights. determined that her suffering would not be the only defining fact of her existence. But the dark underlying truth of violent predators is that they rarely change, they only wait. In the winter of 1997, decades after he had driven his blue van into Del Puerto Canyon, police in Florida were called to the home of an elderly man. Inside, they found a grim, blood-soaked scene. A woman named Roxanne Hayes, a mother working as a sex worker, had been brutally murdered, stabbed repeatedly. The man sitting in the house, covered in her blood, was Lawrence Singleton. He was now nearly 70 years old, but the capacity for absolute violence had never left him. It had merely been dormant, waiting for an opportunity, waiting for another vulnerable woman to cross his path. The murder of Roxanne Hayes was a devastating confirmation of the worst fears of the public and the ultimate failure of the system. Singleton was tried, convicted, and this time sentenced to death. He died in a prison hospital of natural causes in 2001, escaping the executioner's needle. The fact that he was allowed to live long enough to destroy another life remains a bitter, jagged pill in the history of American jurisprudence. The story of the 1978 highway attack leaves a permanent, unsettling chill. It forces a confrontation with the reality that true monsters do not announce themselves with fangs or glowing eyes. They drive blue vans. They speak softly. They look like grandfathers. And the systems designed to protect society from them are often bound by rigid, blind bureaucracy that values the technicalities of the law over the protection of the innocent. When you drive down a deserted canyon road today and you see a concrete drainage pipe half buried in the dry earth, it is impossible not to think of the silence of that gorge. It is impossible not to think of the sheer, terrifying randomness of evil and the unimaginable, lonely struggle of a girl covered in mud, climbing out of the dark, refusing to die.